You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 18th of March 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
What's happening in Ukraine is not good, but we're going to see if we can work a peace agreement, a ceasefire and peace, and I think we'll be able to do it. I'm speaking to President Putin.
We'll have analysis of what's expected when Presidents Trump and Putin speak later today. We'll cross to Cape Town to find out why South Africa is in Washington's firing line. We'll look at the latest in trade and defence stories coming out of Switzerland, and we'll return to Cannes to find out why the Nordics are leading the way in sustainable cities. Plus, we'll have a look through the front pages, have a roundup of arts and culture news, and then...
On the hand may be quite continental, but diamonds are a girl's best friend.
Why diamonds and other precious stones and gold are still a girl's best friend. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Israeli airstrikes in Gaza killed at least 200 people, Palestinian health authorities said, as attacks hit dozens of targets early this morning, ending a weeks-long standoff over extending the ceasefire that halted fighting in January. Germany's lower house of parliament is set to vote today on a massive surge in borrowing that could boost Europe's largest economy and stimulate growth across the region, even as it faces trade tensions with top partner, the United States. And Rwanda-backed M23 have pulled out of peace talks with the Democratic Republic of Congo's government, less than 24 hours before the warring parties in eastern Congo's worst conflict in decades were due to convene in Angola. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now we start with the US-brokered proposed ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. President Donald Trump has said that progress on negotiations had been made over the weekend, and he'll have a phone call with President Vladimir Putin later today. Well, I'm joined now by Quentin Peel, who's a journalist and a commentator. He was a former FT Moscow correspondent. Quentin, Trump says negotiations so far have included dividing up certain assets. What might those concessions consist of, and will Ukraine agree?
Well, it sounds ominously like they might be really just talking about Russia keeping control of the land that it's already conquered in eastern Ukraine, i.e. Russia wants what it's got and is not really prepared to give anything else away. But actually, if there's going to be a ceasefire, Russia's got to start to make concessions for its part. And it's not at all clear that that's going to be on the table at these talks between Putin and Trump. So the whole thing seems to be rather lopsided.
I mean, the groundwork for the talks has been prepared by Steve Witkoff, the US Special Envoy to the region. What has the feedback on his Moscow meetings been so far?
Well, just this, that they're talking about land and they're talking about power stations. Mr. Witkoff doesn't seem to be very much of an expert on the region at all. He's actually primarily their Middle East envoy, and he's himself a real estate developer, just like the president, Donald Trump. So it's not clear that he's actually got all the pieces in a row to get these negotiations off on a good footing.
And how involved is Ukraine in the negotiations?
Well, Ukraine, I think, is really quite worried about the way things are going, but is in a very tight corner. As you know, they agreed to the ceasefire after the US had actually suspended its supplies and suspended it giving intelligence to Ukraine. So they were in a very difficult position, and they said, OK, we'll go ahead with this ceasefire. So Ukraine is lined up, but Russia is not. And what really, I think, concerns me is I'm not at all sure that Donald Trump himself is very well prepared for these talks. I mean, we've already heard from his press spokesman that the talks will include discussing this nuclear power station, the Zaporizhzhia power station, which is the largest nuclear power station in Europe. And she seemed to think that it was on the border between Russia and Ukraine. It's nowhere near the border. It's deep inside Ukraine, but it is, in fact, already in the control of Russia. So it's not clear that they really know what they're talking about.
I'd like to bring in Michael Binyon now, who's foreign affairs specialist for The Times. Michael, what has President Zelensky said about Russia and Putin's tactics?
Well, he's said that Putin intends to deceive. He's said that Putin doesn't tell the truth and that he can't be trusted. And he's virtually written off the possibility of a deal from the start, saying that Mr. Putin will not honour any agreement made. He's been pretty negative, but on the other hand, he's made it quite clear that he's not criticising President Trump and that he's ready to listen to what Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin are going to say after their talk.
And I mean, what Putin is saying is he's making fresh demands on Ukraine. Quentin, what else does he want?
Well, it's pretty clear that he wants Ukraine, one, not to rearm at all during the ceasefire, and he wants Western supplies to Ukraine to be stopped. So those are two pretty drastic demands. He also, what we've heard is he wants the Ukrainian soldiers that are left in the Kursk region of Russia to surrender. They're already pretty much retreating, and there's very little of the Kursk region that they still control, I think. But nonetheless, he clearly wants all these preconditions met before he'll agree to the ceasefire. The suspicion is that really he's not really wanting to agree to a ceasefire yet at all. He just wants to drag things out.
And Michael, what's the situation then on the ground currently within Ukraine and in the Kursk region?
Well, the Ukrainians have been more or less driven out of the Kursk region. The Russians have launched a pretty massive assault, and for the past 3 days, the Ukrainians have been retreating, bringing out their weapons, their cars, their armoured cars, and getting out more or less as fast as they can. They're trying to make a final last-ditch stand towards the border with Ukraine, but it looks as though they've ordered a general retreat because the Russians seem to be overwhelmingly with the advantage there. So they've certainly had to back away. They are also very worried that the Russians are launching a large new assault on one of the towns quite close to the Ukrainian border, where already people are being asked to leave. In fact, there's pressure along most of the eastern front. So the Ukrainians are very much on the defensive and rather fearful that it's going to be very hard to hold back a full-scale Russian push.
And just back to these talks happening today, Quentin, I mean, is there any chance that perhaps later down the line, NATO and the EU will be involved?
Well, Russia has said that any foreign troops that are in Ukraine, supposedly as peacekeepers, they will regard as combatants. And they made it very clear that they do not want any NATO forces, any European forces that are also members of NATO, to be involved in this. So actually, nothing has been accepted from the Russian side on the Europeans actually being the peacekeepers. We've heard that there could be as many as 30 countries involved in a coalition of the willing to try and secure the peace. But certainly so far, Putin has not given any indication that he's happy with that situation. In fact, precisely the opposite. He's very unhappy with that situation.
And Michael, finally, how key is the outcome of these talks today to the future security of Europe?
Well, they're very important because if it looks as though President Trump is giving away virtually everything to the Russians that they've asked for, then the European NATO allies will feel extremely vulnerable, and they'll feel that they've not only not been consulted, but they've been more or less sidelined in their insistence that Ukraine must be properly looked after and defended, and they'll feel that the Americans are going their own way. This will increase general anxiety about the future coherence of NATO NATO, and in particular whether Mr. Trump is manoeuvring to either withdraw from NATO or certainly distance himself from the European allies in the alliance. And that, I think, is going to be a cause of great concern. It does depend, of course, very much on what comes out of these talks and whether the Europeans are going to be informed or consulted or in any way engaged in whatever the next steps are.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. Michael Binion there and Quentin Peel. This is The Globalist. It's just coming up to 11 minutes past 9 in Pretoria, 7:11 here in London. Donald Trump has had South Africa firmly in his sights since taking office just 2 months ago, which is surprising as the country's never been a priority for the US. Trump has invited so-called Afrikaner refugees to settle in the US, and he suspended aid over the signing of the Expropriation Act. His Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, announced in January that the US would boycott the G20 summit in Johannesburg in November. And over the weekend, Rubio said that the South African ambassador to Washington, Ibrahim Rasool, is persona non grata. He's been given 72 hours to leave. He's no longer welcome in the country. Well, joining me now down the line from Cape Town is the Africa analyst Brendan von Essen. Brendan, many thanks for coming back on the show. What has prompted this US focus on South Africa?
Hi, Georgina, and thank you for having me on. Well, several reasons have brought South Africa to the attention of the US. I do think we have to acknowledge that the largest one is South Africa's case against genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. This has been a source of tension between South Africa and the US even under the Biden administration, and it has made South Africa a major focus of the Trump administration. And this has been compounded by interest groups lobbying in the States on misinformation around the nature of South Africa's Expropriation Act, the nature of race relations in South Africa. And this is also compounded with the fact that as part of Trump's larger attack on what is called DEI in the States, has brought focus on South Africa's own transformation laws and agenda here, which has irked a lot of his supporters and a lot of Trump's allies.
Why was the ambassador, Rasool, booted out? What did he say?
So Ibrahim Rasool was giving comments to a seminar, an online seminar, during which he described Trump as a white nationalist, or the leader of a white nationalist movement, or white supremacist movement, that was overly concerned about US demographic shifts. The US took umbrage at this and then declared him PNG, which is quite a drastic move to do in a diplomatic sense. And so I think Rasool's criticism may be undiplomatic, but I think the South African government has been very surprised by the intensity of the US response.
So how much has this to do with the involvement of Elon Musk, one of just a number of tech billionaires in Trump's inner circle with ties to South Africa? I mean, I think others include the PayPal co-founder Peter Thiel and the White House crypto advisor David Sachs. All of these men grew up in relative privilege under the apartheid regime. Are they pushing Trump?
I think they are. I think they definitely are a motivating factor, again, compounding the other pressures and motivations around the ICJ case and other issues. I think you should also note that Musk is having issues launching his satellite internet service in South Africa due to South Africa's transformation laws around ownership and employment equity. And I do think that is also a part motivator. But these guys a lot of them have expressed sympathy for the apartheid eras and have, again, expressed sympathy for around the myths of white repression in South Africa.
So can you tell us about that repression? What is the deal here about the Afrikaner refugee issue?
Well, I think simply put, there isn't an Afrikaner refugee issue. This ties with a wider disinformation campaign that has been perpetuated by a few interest groups in South Africa, most notably AfriForum, around a false sense of oppression of white South Africans, particularly white Afrikaans South Africans, again, relating to fake claims of genocide, fake claims of dispossession. And I think it's very important to note that the overwhelming number of whites and white Afrikaners reject this as a notion. This is very much a minority issue pushed by people on the right who are conspiracy theorists. But I also do think many will probably try and take Trump up on his refugee offer. I think many will view it as a quick quick route to a green card or quick route to getting economically migrating to the US.
Because just to be clear, that the Afrikaner farmers, or generally white farmers in South Africa, are usually victims of violence. This is not state-sponsored expropriation of land with violence, as we saw in Zimbabwe.
Oh, not even the slightest. And I think that's part of the problem with the disinformation campaign, is because they are trying to conflate a racial repression issue with South Africa's very serious crime issues, especially in our rural areas. And if you dig into the crime stats around farm violence, that doesn't just apply to the murders and the high rate of murder, doesn't just apply to white farmers, it also applies to farm workers, farmers of all races. And even the expropriation issue, the expropriation land issue is just a typical eminent domain bill that does allow for certain instances where land can be expropriated without compensation. Race is not one of those issues. They largely pertain to land that has been abandoned, land that is a threat to public safety, or land that the state needs to drive economic development.
Could another issue that's annoying the US be SA's push to be more closely aligned with Iran, particularly through BRICS?
Yes, I think the US is, but that they've long had issue with South Africa's close and historical ties with Iran. But South Africa's ties aren't that close that it should be such a major issue. But it did not help that the largest party in our ruling coalition and long-time ruling party, the ANC, did have a meeting with the Iranian ambassador around this time.
There are a couple of threats that seem to be coming down the line, indeed one already having an impact, and that's funding for fighting HIV. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, that's actually been a big concern, not just for South Africa, but the wider Africa region, is that the US has been a significant supporter and funder of efforts to combat HIV/AIDS on the continent, both through programs through USAID as well as PEPFAR, the US presidential plan to focus on combating HIV/AIDS. The loss of that funding is going to hurt. South Africa has about 14,000 healthcare workers who are funded by the US. So our healthcare system will take a hit, and you'll see in South Africa and neighboring countries, you might start to see some of the gains that have been made against HIV/AIDS spreads being reversed. So this is a real concern. The US has claimed that not all AIDS funding has been impacted, but given that the USAID is the largest implementing agency and that agency has largely been dismantled, the impact is already being felt.
So in September, there's going to be a review of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. That's AGOA. It's a 25-year-old trade deal that allows duty-free access to a wide range of goods from 32 African countries, including South Africa. The threats that this will be terminated are very real. And what might that impact be on the country?
So yes, there's a very good chance that AGOA will repealed or South Africa will lose its AGOA access. It will cause some economic harm. Thankfully, South Africa no longer has much more diversified trade relations than it did when AGOA was first implemented. But it will hit industries such as our citrus farmers, our wine farmers, and our automotive industry. And even though it won't be necessarily devastating, given South Africa's weak economic growth and weak performance at present, it could push South Africa into recession, because any impact to our trade relations and any loss of export income would be felt quite intensely at the moment.
And finally, who will the next South African ambassador to Washington be? Who can take on the challenges that we've just laid out? Can Pretoria's position be recalibrated? Can America be re-engaged?
I do not know. As yet, the presidency and the International Relations Department have not revealed who the next ambassador will be. I do think President Ramaphosa will take some time to work out who would be the best suited and how to address this changed relationship with the US. Until then, the South Africa's diplomatic matters in the US will probably be led by the Deputy Chief of Mission, Ishmael Assau, who is an experienced diplomat, and he is a diplomat on the ground. And I think Ramaphosa will also definitely wait till the furore around this matter has died down, so any appointment won't bring so much media attention or scrutiny by the US government.
Brendan Van Essen in Cape Town, thank you very much indeed. Now, still to come on the programme.
What's interesting about Copenhagen and Denmark, it's probably one of the most sophisticated public-private partnership ecosystems anywhere in the world.
We'll return to our coverage of MIPIM and discuss why Nordic countries are way ahead in decarbonisation. This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's time to talk global as well as Mediterranean news now with the Athens-based journalist Emmanuel Papavasiliou. Manos, welcome back to Monocle Radio.
Oh, hi, Georgina. Nice to be here.
We've just been talking about the US and the fact that it's dropping funding of a lot of key programs in South Africa. Well, another key program that it's going to cease giving money to is the Voice of America and various other media organizations. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, basically last Friday in the US, President Trump, under an order titled Continuing the Reduction of the Federal Bureaucracy, he ordered his administration to reduce several agencies to the minimum required by law. And in fact, the decision affected the US Agency for Global Media that houses Voice of America, Radio Free Europe and Asia, and Radio Marti, which broadcasts Spanish language news in Cuba. So basically as of right now, Voice of America staff, in fact, have all been placed virtually on leave. It's an unprecedented crackdown on state-funded media and press access, but is it shocking anymore? Is it every day lately? We tend to wake up to the latest "what did Trump just do" headline. So I think maybe that's why he's now against people who write headlines. I don't know. So
what he's also done is he's banned some of the top news agencies from covering White House press conferences.
Yeah, so this follows also the fact that on the 21st of February, the Associated Press and other big news agencies were restricted from attending presidential events. In fact, the Associated Press has sued over this. And it's all because of the White House wanted to respond to the fact that they refused to refer to the Gulf of Mexico as Gulf of America now.
As you say, we wake up every morning to these headlines. What has Trump done next? That just seems so ridiculous when you say it out loud. The danger, of course, is that it creeps up, and we cease to be outraged.
We cease to be outraged, but in fact, what Trump is doing right now is very contradictory to what Trump has said he wants to do to make America great again. But by cutting things, the voices like the Voice of America, you lose access to the whole world. In fact, just to make you understand, Voice of America was not what the White House has branded as left-wing propaganda. In fact, it was founded in 1942 to counter Nazi propaganda and spread the Voice of America as it is known throughout the world. According to the latest numbers that I see here, it reaches 360 million people a week all over the world, and it operates in nearly 50 languages. If anything, Voice of America can be a tool for American soft power and influence for the world.
Let's move on and have a look at Rwanda, because the country's cut diplomatic ties with Belgium. Why is that?
So Rwanda has cut diplomatic ties with Belgium, and it's all because of what is happening in the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo, or this is at least, the excuse of this. So in the DRC, as listeners might be following the news, there's been an ongoing conflict since the beginning of the year between an armed group called the M23 and DRC's armed forces in the east of the country. Now, Rwanda has been blamed by Western forces especially Belgium, that they have been supporting this armed group, the M23. In fact, according to intelligence sources, a lot of Rwandan troops have been killed in covert operations there. But this has been used by Rwandan President Paul Kagame to say that, in fact, Belgium has acted like their little children, that they have been completely undermined as a small country, etc. Keen listeners might think that Belgium, being the former colonial power of Rwanda, Kagame using these lines maybe to boost his image within the country. However, what is a little bit of a timing, ironically, today in the DRC, we're expecting to have DRC forces and the M23 armed group meeting up for peace talks.
Late breaking news on that, actually. They've cancelled those talks because of the sanctions, as we've been reporting in our headlines. Let's move on and have a look at Japan, because the price of hiking Fuji this summer has doubled. Why is that?
Yeah, so Japan is, as always, preparing for another huge surge in tourism. Mount Fuji is one of its most famous landmarks, and it's definitely feeling the impact. We saw this news last year as well. And in order to combat overcrowding, the authorities had placed hiking permit fees for the summer. This year, they're doubling the hiking permit fees because they believe that this might deter a little bit from over-tourism and people just, bringing in havoc in all over the country. It's part of a broader problem in Japan because cities like Kyoto, Tokyo have already struggled with record high visitor numbers, and now even natural landmarks are seeing the effects. So whether price hikes alone will solve this issue is unclear for now, but Japan is just betting that fewer and more responsible visitors are better than unchecked crowds.
And let's bring it home to where you are now in Greece. Winemakers are all up in arms because of Trump's threat to impose a 200% tariff on EU alcohol exports. So tell us what that means for Greek winemakers.
Yeah, so we talked about Trump and how he's disrupting things at home. Let's talk about Trump and how he's going to disrupt things abroad. So as the Trump administration has threatened for a 200% tariff on European alcohol export, what is little known is that Greek winemakers specifically are set to feel this because, in fact, about 20% of the Greek wine exports go to the US rather than the EU. In fact, if you live in Europe, in anywhere in Europe, most probably you don't know of Greek wines, but Americans do. And it's sold at a much higher point in America than in Europe. Just to make you understand, Greek winemakers sell for €7 per kilogram in the US. In Germany, they sell it for $2.75. However, basically, they are hoping that these tariffs might not touch them because Trump specifically is thought to be targeting German and French wines.
So Greek winemakers might be able to breathe easy. Manos, thank you very much indeed. That's Emmanuel Papavasiliou speaking to us from Athens. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Israeli airstrikes in Gaza killed at least 200 people, Palestinian health authorities said, as attacks hit dozens of targets early this morning, ending a weeks-long standoff over extending the ceasefire that halted fighting in January. Strikes were reported in multiple locations, Palestinian health ministry officials said. Many of the dead were children. Germany's lower house of parliament is set to vote today on a massive surge in borrowing that could boost Europe's largest economy and stimulate growth across the region, even as it faces trade tensions with top partner, the United States. The Conservatives and Social Democrats, who are in talks to form a centrist coalition after last month's elections, want to create a €500 billion fund for infrastructure and to ease constitutionally enshrined borrowing rules to allow higher spending on security. And Rwanda-backed M23 have pulled out of peace talks with the Democratic Republic of Congo's government, less than 24 hours before the warring parties in eastern Congo's worst conflict in decades were due to convene in Angola. The rebel alliance, of which M23 is a member, said it was withdrawing from what could have been the two sides' first direct negotiations because of European Union sanctions imposed earlier in the day against M23 and Rwandan officials. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. And now for a closer look behind the headlines. Are we seeing the end of Obamas and Jacindas? Monocle's foreign editor, Alexis Self, reflects on the end of the era of leaders who are more popular outside of their country than within.
While speaking to a Kiwi colleague the other day, it struck me how differently Jacinda Ardern is still thought of by people outside of New Zealand as compared to her compatriots. In 2017, when she first came to power, the former Prime Minister possessed the key attributes beloved by liberal internationalists. She was eloquent, educated abroad, and keen to sell her country as a haven for progressive politics. At home, she was popular enough to win 2 elections, the second of which was a landslide. But her failure to address issues such as New Zealand's acute housing crisis, gang violence, and the socio-economic costs of extremely restrictive coronavirus lockdowns eventually led to her plummeting popularity and subsequent resignation. In hindsight, Ardern was one of the last of a dying breed. A liberal leader whose global adulation compensated for their domestic divisiveness or even unpopularity. I would put people such as Barack Obama, Sanna Marin, and to an extent Justin Trudeau into the same category. All were beloved by large sections of the world's media and on first-name terms with foreign electorates, but remained polarising figures at home where their legacies are tainted by the fact that they often appeared more interested in bestriding the world stage than solving the nitty-gritty problems that matter most to voters. It is a common adage that all political careers necessarily end in failure, but perhaps the clearest sign of the demise of the liberal internationalist is the fact that none of these formerly exalted leaders has remained in public service post-retirement. In the past, they might have been handed leadership of a multilateral organisation, such as Antonio Guterres and the UN, or very publicly championed a cause close to their hearts, such as Jimmy Carter and world peace. But the demise of the liberal internationalist has mirrored the fading importance of such bodies, and the current tenor of political debate probably makes politicians hesitant to remain in the fray. While Trudeau is still in early retirement, it is notable that neither Obama, Marin, Ardern, nor indeed Angela Merkel, another former darling of the liberal world order, have continued working in the public realm after stepping down. The heirs to this cohort, such as Emmanuel Macron or Keir Starmer, have had to turn their naturally internationalist policies inward, focusing on issues such as immigration, while framing debates around, for example, European defence, in ways that play on nativist concerns rather than multilateral pretensions. The age of the Obamas and Jacindas is over, and we are now in the era of the Trumps and the Orbans. Today, people ask not what their country can do for others, but only what it can do for itself.
Thanks, Lex. And for more from Monocle's editors and correspondents, sign up for our free daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute, at monocle.com/minute. We turn to Switzerland now, and a round of stories making headlines there. To discuss the latest issues, I'm joined in from Zurich by Gorana Gergic, who is Monocle's security correspondent. Gorana, good to have you back on the show. Can we begin with the Swiss trade delegation to Washington? What's the background to that?
Absolutely. So the background here is that the United States has recently placed Switzerland and a whole host of other countries on a list of countries that it accuses of engaging in unfair trade practices. So this was confirmed by the director of the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, or here known as SECO, Helene Budliger-Artieda. And basically, she has now engaged in kind of a reaction mode and damage control from what has been coming from the United States side, especially the trade representative there, Jamieson Greer, who has urged American companies to report unfair practices, especially those from G20 countries who have significant trade surplus, and Switzerland basically falls in quite a lot of these categories. But what the Swiss side is trying to do is to make clear that Switzerland's trade practices have been fair, that it has actually been engaged in unilateral abolition of some of the industrial tariffs when it comes to some of the US exports to Switzerland. So now we have the kind of back and forth going, and again, the Swiss government side at least trying to minimize the damage from what is imminent to come when the US administration announces the next round of tariffs that they're preparing, and those will be in place in early April.
More sensitive negotiations. Germany is mulling limiting the purchase of Swiss-made weapons. What's been said on this and why?
Look, this has been a long-standing story now, basically ever since Russia's full-scale invasion and war against Ukraine, where, of course, we've seen a whole host of European countries really scrambling to get military aid to Ukraine, and finding that their stocks, of course, are insufficient. And, it's been a running story over the past 3 years. And, of course, Germany has been part of this effort, one of the biggest contributors, actually, to Ukraine's military aid. But it has run into some troubles when it was ordering military equipment from Switzerland. So the issue here stems actually from Switzerland's War Material Act, which places strict limits and restrictions on exports of Swiss weapons from countries that they have been exported to third countries if those countries are engaged in conflicts like, of course, Ukraine here. And so German ambassador to Switzerland just recently told Swiss parliamentarians that these rules make Switzerland not so much of a desirable partner moving forward when it comes to weapons acquisition, because, of course, we know Europe is now engaged in almost a military spending bonanza, right? And it is looking to partners. Of course, it's looking to amp up production domestically. But for these worries that Switzerland or Swiss government in particular could block re-exports if it chose to at a time when Europe is really dealing with this sort of challenge of Russia being a threat and the United States not being so reliable in providing security guarantees, is something that makes Europeans, now at least Germans from this perspective, a bit worried about how this sort of trade relationship might move forward.
Gorana, thank you very much indeed. That's Gorana Gergic. You're with Monocle Radio. From North Harbour in Copenhagen to UN 17, the world's first neighbourhood designed to meet all 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. Urban Partners is redefining how cities grow. At the forefront of this vision is Jessie Shapins, the head of urban strategy and design at Urban Partners, whose work bridges investment, sustainability and urban design. Well, Monocle's editor-in-chief, Andrew Tuck, caught up with Jessie at MIPIM in Cannes to talk about why the Nordics are leading the way in decarbonising cities, the future of neighbourhood-scale development, and how smart investments can create more livable, resilient urban spaces. Andrew started by asking Jessie about the scale of some of his work and the advantages of working on a neighbourhood scale.
So we, as a firm, invest in single buildings across all different asset classes and uses, but we also do have a sort of specialized area that we've been building up over the last 10 years, really, focused on neighborhood scale investments and development. So specifically how to work with public authorities, how to work with communities, how to really think about what becomes possible when you actually can take a holistic view and take a long-term perspective. We were one of the first investors to work alongside the City and Port Authority partnership for the Nordhavn development. It's a really sort of significant transformation project of the old port in Copenhagen that just 12 years ago was not an area where anybody could walk as a regular citizen, and now is one of the most vibrant areas in the city. And the reason for that success, we believe, is very much thinking not just about the buildings, but the space between the buildings, and thinking about the role of the public realm. And also our work here was very much to say the public realm doesn't just stop sort of with the outdoor plazas. The ground floor spaces we see very much as an integral part of public realm, and actually acknowledging that if you work on a single building scale, very often you basically just end up with the sort of most boring average shop you can imagine down in the ground floor space. If you work at a whole neighborhood, you can really get the mix of local businesses that you need to make an exciting and interesting neighborhood for all the residents and visitors. So we did this with the City and Port Authority, where we created a joint venture to actually own and operate all the ground floor spaces in the neighborhood, which allows us to have a mix where some get a little bit less rent. You might have a new local bookstore that is created, but then you also have your large supermarket. All of that blending and getting to work at a neighborhood scale completely changes what's possible, and again makes it possible to do things that we think have greater societal benefit, but we've seen real commercial benefit as well by taking that approach.
So North Harbour in English, or Nordhavn if you say it badly, not very Danish, in a more Germanic way, but is Nordhavn.
Yes.
I've been to the neighbourhood, and one of the things that struck me was I had to go and see friends there, and I was staying at a hotel in the centre of the city, and I said to the concierge, what's the easiest way to get there? And he said, take the bicycle at the front of the hotel. Yeah. And the bicycle route there was simple, an amazing local bar that we went to. There was a nice pizza place around the corner. It was a summer's evening, people using the water, an amazing project. Is there really no friction from planning to delivery? You sound very aligned with what city government wants, but I'm sure that Danes are pressing you to go faster and further on some things. How do you bring along a community there? Is there still a necessity for public engagement, community engagement before you set off?
Yeah, so there's a strong process of community engagement in the major development projects in Copenhagen. I think Nordhavn itself is sort of going through its next evolution and transformation, as beyond just the sort of first quarter that you saw the outer areas, and there's an extensive public process now around sort of what the vision and sort of future for those areas should be. And another major project that we have underway, this is still in the zoning process, so it is very much in the kind of public hearing and public engagement process, is the Railroad City District, which is just near the central train station in the city, the old sort of freight rail yards of the city. And for that, there's been a long-standing process working with local councils, local residents associations. But I think at least for us, one of the things that's important is a lot of the approach to community engagement traditionally is, you show up and you have your classic meetings where only a certain number of people come. For us, it's quite interesting to say, how do you actually start to work with community, even in an early stage, to start to build the community for the future? So in this Railroad City District project, already in the zoning, we're taking an old railway building, working with all these different local associations, working with the municipality and its different divisions to actually create a community center, already in the zoning process. But that same group of associations in that same space will continue into the long-term plan. So it's actually linking your early stage planning and process into your long-term transformation, and actually creating a connection between those two things. So it's not just pure process, you actually are building community, you're putting things into practice, but they're done with the long-term in mind.
And tell me, do you think that the Nordic nations, the Nordicness of what you do, is that an exportable thing? When you go to now outside of the region, when you turn up in other cities with investment plans, are people kind of on your side a little bit because they've seen best practice in many of these northern cities?
Yeah, I think that Copenhagen is widely viewed as an admirable story, and I think it's also actually one of the things that maybe your listeners know, but many people don't. Is, I mean, there is Danish design history, but the city itself 30 years ago was near bankruptcy. So it was a city that was actually declining population, high unemployment, not at all the city that we know and love today. And there was a real intentional approach then taken by both the federal government, the city government, working with also sort of civil society and industry leaders to really use urban planning and urban transformation as a catalyst for the transformation of the city. And I say all that because it actually becomes quite interesting in cities outside Copenhagen now, because it's sort of, while it can feel slow, 30 years for a massive transformation like what we've seen in Copenhagen is actually quite fast. I mean, within a generation, you have the systemic change of a city. And that is actually quite important. And many cities are facing similar challenges to what Copenhagen maybe faced some decades past. And to know that that is possible and some of the ingredients. And I think what's important about the Copenhagen story, and its listeners here, we obviously focus on the wonderful kind of public space, swimming in the harbor, all the things that we can see, the design and the quality, and that matters. But much of what made Copenhagen's transformation possible is the way that you had partnerships, the way that sort of behind the scenes different actors collaborated, and the way that you put strategic planning into practice, and the way that you actually worked creatively with finance. So I'm originally from the United States, and I think for many Americans, in a way, Denmark sounds like this kind of crazy socialist utopia where it's just the government decides everything and makes everything wonderful on behalf of the small population of people. In reality, I think what's interesting about Copenhagen and Denmark, it's probably one of the most sophisticated public-private partnership ecosystems anywhere in the world. You don't have this sort of deep antagonism between the public and private sectors. You have a lot of collaboration to figure out how to solve societal challenges, but do it in a way that makes sense for business as well.
That was Jesse Shappen speaking to Andrew Tuck at MIPIM. And this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. It's time to talk arts and culture news now with the journalist Amma Rose Abrams, who joins me now in the studio. Thanks for coming in, Amma Rose.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I wish, though, that you had happier stories to talk about. The first one isn't so bad, although it gives us a little bit of a mystery. Tell us more about Sotheby's and Pace Gallery. They're in talks for a significant partnership, and in fact, this has been going on since the pandemic.
It has, because on the one side, we've been hearing stories about trouble at Pace and based a lot around their £700,000 a month rent that they pay on their building in New York, and various huge expenses like an $80 million exterior on the building and things like this that have caused whispers to occur. And I think they pulled out of, or there's kind of discussion as to whether or not they pulled out of part of Art Basel, just this last one gone in 2024, and it caused a lot of gossip on the ground. And then with Sotheby's, you've had Patrick Drahi taking money out of the business, laying people off, investing in property in the Met Breuer building in the centre of New York, nobody really knowing what his long-term plan is. And so the fact that these two are in discussions for not an acquisition but a partnership is raising a lot of questions, because obviously people are wondering, what would that partnership be, and what are the ethics of an auction house sharing information and clients with a commercial gallery representing artists' estates, families, individuals.
And complicating it is the fact that Sotheby's closed a deal with Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund, an investment company. So that's a much needed $1 billion lifeline.
A $1 billion lifeline for Sotheby's, yes. But then what does it mean when they are also then perhaps by proxy investing in Pace? And it gets very, very complicated at that stage. And it's like the finance of it can get very kind of confusing, but I think it's important to go back to the fact that when Drahi purchased Sotheby's, he took it private. He took the business private, and maybe when we look back to that, we can understand perhaps he had intentions of doing this kind of thing when he took it off the stock market, the business, so he could have more leeway to kind of, it's almost like he's experimenting.
And what do you think his final aim is?
I think he's using the freedom of the art market to draw capital out, and perhaps to kind of maybe experiment a little bit with where it's going. Lots of people want to invest in art. Sotheby's is a very great kind of like, it's a marquee business. But the art world is changing, and I'm guessing that he is trying to make as much money as possible whilst kind of maximising the glamour of owning an auction house. But let's see how that pans out for the actual auction house.
Job cuts at the Royal Academy, London's Royal Academy, also the Tate.
Yes, Royal Academy and Tate. RA is looking at cutting around 18% of its workforce, and this is a second round of layoffs at the Royal Academy throughout the business. So, I mean, I'm assuming that's from the curators and the management side to people running the day-to-day running of the gallery, museum. And I think it's important to remember the RA is not funded by the government, and so it's slightly different to the cuts at Tate, which is again 7% cut of the business, so slightly less, but this is following a 12% cut in 2020.
So what's happening at the Royal Academy, though, is that there have been protests.
Yes. Over the weekend, lots of people turned up to protest the cuts. They think it's going to really damage the institution. I guess, I mean, this is high profile, high octane jobs. If you're staging exhibitions there's a certain expectation, and you have to get people through the door. I think also they feel like the business will become difficult to run with a 20% cut of the workforce, which you can understand.
Only 7% of the workforce going at the Tate.
Yes, that's slightly less. And I think it's we don't have the details of where in Tate these cuts are coming to the workforce, but it's following 167 people taking redundancy in 2020. And it's also following 40 roles that have been cut through recruitment freezes and restructure. So it may only be 7%, but it's kind of following a slow kind of like pattern of cuts over the last 5 years.
I mean, I think it's quite interesting that critics are saying that the reason that the visitor numbers have dropped off is because of the Tate's curatorial programme, and that what they're basically saying is just not very good. Nobody wants to see it.
I don't know how true that is. I think they've had really fun exhibitions. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. We need to look at the visitor figures. But I feel that they had a big impressionist show. They've had very long running shows. And there was an article about this recently, about how shows since the pandemic are running for almost twice as long. That's one thing that I could imagine would cut visitor figures, because people have seen it already. And so they're not, whereas you might go kind of 3-4 times a year, you're just going twice. And that would make a huge difference. But I haven't seen a huge difference in their programme.
Finally, there's no escaping this. We're back to Trump. Yes. What are his cuts? What impact are his cuts having on the arts?
Well, the latest is, I mean, it's the latest in a long line, isn't it? The latest is that he has issued an executive order asking for severe cuts to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which gives huge support to museums. I mean, the list of things that they give to runs from kind of arboretums, art museums, history museums, and all the different kind of regional and smaller museums that you might be able to imagine. And he's calling for what he's saying is severe cuts to this, and so they run the libraries basically and the museums. What this means for the US museum ecosystem, I think we have to wait and see, because it's another one of his shout something very loudly, and then everybody has to see where the dust settles. But essentially, this body funds some of the biggest art museums in the United States and is a big funder. So, I mean, it's giving grants of like $250,000. So any institutions missing out on this funding will see a huge loss. And obviously, we know in the US, public funding for museums is slightly scarce. So it'll be a big impact on these institutions.
Emma Rose, thank you very much indeed. That's Emma Rose Abrams there. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
According to the Luxury Investment Index compiled by Knight Frank, as assets such as whiskey, wine and fine art decrease sharply in value, jewellery is the second fastest growing luxury asset class, or at least it was last year. And in the past 10 years, precious stones have increased in value by a third. Well, joining me now is Brenda Toohey, who's Monocle's Luxury Markets Editor. I've always loved that title, Brenda.
Yeah, me too. Good morning.
Kind of sumptuous, isn't it?
Good morning, Georgina.
Why are whiskey, wine and art no longer so desirable?
I mean, I think it's quite simple. I think that, you have to store wines, climate control, perhaps your art, it can be susceptible to deterioration. But investing in jewelry is quite easy. You can buy it, you can wear it. It's lots of little things that can fit in your pocket if you need to run away from somewhere. I think it's just easier to manage.
So what jewellery in particular are we seeing rising in value?
I think all of the big houses are seeing a rise. Cartier, Van Cleef & Arpels, Tiffany, they've all brought in exciting designers, creating unusual and modern pieces for a younger market. They're just very, very attractive. People like jewelry. I mean, if you head to Dubai, they're covered in jewelry on the beach. It's there's a lot of jewelry around.
It's interesting. You talk about the younger market. So who is buying this? They're younger. Where does the money come from? Where are they based?
I think they're in London. They're in Hong Kong, New York, Paris, Dubai. They have their money and they'd like to invest in statement pieces. Cartier's Love Bangle or Van Cleef & Arpels' Alhambra collection is always continually appearing, at parties, maybe not on the beach because some of those slices of malachite or mother of pearl might be susceptible to damage in the sea. But you certainly see all of Cartier's, all of Van Cleef & Arpels, Boucheron.
And it's not necessarily just the new collections that are coming out. Vintage jewellery is absolutely holding its value.
It certainly is. And beautiful pieces with wonderful gemstones certainly never lose their value. Rubies, sapphires, emeralds, the kind of classics are as hot now as they have ever been. And people are a little bit more wily about what they're buying, too. They're looking for stones that haven't been heat treated. They're looking for stones perhaps with certificates.
Are people concerned about the ethics of it? Blood diamonds, for instance?
I think they certainly are. And because of that, some people are investing in man-made diamonds. But myself, I would suggest that you stay with natural diamonds.
I mean, do man-made have that value?
I would imagine that there could be a problem when you try to resell your man-made diamond, that, in fact, with a natural diamond, it should go up in value as the years go by. But I would imagine with a man-made diamond that it won't be the same. It's not going to hold its value.
So does gold still remain the ultimate insurance policy?
I think it does. I think when times are tough, or we're living in a rather precarious kind of a world right now, gold certainly is a secure investment.
So We are in times of turmoil.
We are.
What would you be buying right now?
Gold. I think I would buy gold. Gold, diamonds. I think you can't go wrong with a piece of jewelry, especially if you're buying things from the secondary market. But even if you're not, something that you can wear daily. You love your pearls.
I do love my pearls.
Yeah, and you wear them daily, and that's wonderful. People become, invested also personally in a piece of jewelry, and often think that it could be not just an investment, but an heirloom, for future family members. So there's a lot of emotional attachment in a piece of jewelry that maybe isn't the same as in a bottle of wine.
Mm-hmm. And finally, I can see you've got the most gorgeous watch on. What of what you're wearing would you take with you? If you had to flee?
I would definitely take this Piaget Polo watch, which is a vintage watch created in 1979 by Piaget. They did release it last year, again, without diamonds, the Piaget Polo, and it looks just as modern and cool now as it did, in 1979.
Absolutely. Looks completely gorgeous. Brenda, I hope you never have to sew it into your coat lining. Thank you very much indeed. That's Brenda Toohey. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Carlotta Rebello, Tom Webb and Anita Riotta, our researcher, Francesca Gilks, and our studio manager, Lily Austin. After the headlines, there's more music on the way, and the briefing is live at midday in London. The Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.